And we are recording. It's not quite 8 yet. I do want to at least start the announcements, or at least the reminders. Nothing new to begin with at first. Yes, it is still too late to retake the first 3 exams to change your grade, but you can still take them for practice. It's, good to help you with the final. And if you meet me online to get the correct answers, I can give you a 5% boost to any of those 3 grades. So any questions about that? Okay, so again, final exam will be this Monday in person. We start at 8 officially. I'm usually here by 7:20 at the latest. If you get here early and I'm here, you can start as early as you want, but you have to end by 9:50. If you want to, you can bring something to write with. I'm going to provide scrap paper. Bring a calculator if you need to, because you can't use your phone. Bring a charger, right? Because it's going to be on the computer, and if it takes you all that time, the computer might need to be charged. Make sure you bring all that. Let me know if you can't make it. I know I keep saying this, but someone's going to screw it up. If you just don't show up on Monday and I haven't heard from you before Friday, you're just going to get a 0. Now, granted, just like most other exams, you'll be able to retake the exam. So if you were to get 100 on your retake, if your average is 0 to 100, you're going to get a 50%. So I don't recommend it. So again, let me know if you can't make it, or you just don't want to make it, whatever the case may be. Anyway, on a related note too, since it's final exam and you don't want to be hungry and things like that, I'm hoping I can pull off stopping at Tim Hortons on my way here and bring some coffee and some food. So if you guys have any requests of what kind of food you might want from Food Horton, Tim Hortons, send me an email or include it in your attendance email. I'll see if I can make that happen. I'm not sure yet. It has a lot to do with my home life, because sometimes getting out the door in the morning is crazy. Anyway, I would like to do an exam review. I've been talking about it. Some people are interested. I haven't locked down any times or dates. So just let me know when and if you would like to do that. In a perfect world, I can just do one, and everybody would show up, whether it be in person or online. But I know that's probably not going to work. But I'm committed to giving you an exam review if you want one. So most likely, I'm going to have a number of exam reviews. If you email me and we find a time, it's like, all right, Friday at 2 p.m., we're going to be online and doing the exam review. If I can lock one down for you, then I'll send out an announcement to everybody. Like, hey, I'm meeting so-and-so at 2 p.m. on Friday. You're all invited. So that being said, keep an eye on your emails, keep an eye on your announcements, because unfortunately at the end of the semester, I will be sending a lot of things because I want to help you. So any questions about an exam review? All right, today's lab, again, is a free lab. You're not required to be here. I will be here, and I will be online from 9 until 10:50 in case you need help with those old labs. And I wouldn't blame you, because it's such a long time ago. You're trying to decipher what this data means, and maybe you're looking at your original lab and wondering why you missed a point there. Let me help you. That's what I'm there to do. And take advantage of this free lab, right? Pick a lab. Pick your worst lab that really needs fixing and do that. So any questions about lab this week? Okay, really quickly, participation points, the way they always are. You're going to send me an email, and in the email, you're going to write, have a list of all the attendance words they give throughout the video. If you're online right now, or if you're watching the video later, also include screenshots every time I say one of those attendance words. Ask at least one question about the material covered in the lecture. And of course, if you're watching the video, like or comment on it, and make sure you include a screenshot that shows that as proof. This is all just evidence for the people watching the video that you watched it, right? None of it is proof that you watched the video, but it all provides evidence. I will notice, or I have noticed too, by the way, I'm gotten really bad at noticing that if you have liked or commented on it, it's usually included in one of your screenshots, and I miss it. So, forgive me in advance if I email you back and say, hey, there's no proof that you liked or commented on the video. You can say, yeah, there is, you missed it. Feel free to always call me out when I make a mistake. And not just with that stuff, with anything. So is there any questions about any of this or anything else before we jump in? And when we jump in, we're going to hit the ground running because we are short on time. Okay, really quickly, I'll do attendance. This will be very quick since there's only 2 of you physically here. We have Barrett and Inca. No one else is here. All right. So yeah, like I said, I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to move very quickly because we only have this lecture and the next lecture, and then that's it. And really quickly, before we move forward, I'll point one more thing out. Due to that fact, you're still responsible for everything in the last 3 chapters, right? Chapters 19, 20, and 21. I hope to be able to finish the lectures before then, but it'll be on you to still, you're still responsible for that material, even if I don't get a chance to lecture on it. But if you go to that list of lectures, if you really want to see a lecture on it, and I don't have time this week, you can go watch from last semester. I finished it last semester, so you can watch them there if you want. But anyway, let's jump into it. The first word for attendance is Harold Urey, or let's just abbreviate it, HU. Today would be his birthday. He's related to, not necessarily, not directly it's biology, but in a roundabout way. So for extra credit in a different email, feel free to send me an email and explain why he's famous. Don't forget to include a link to your source if you do that. So this is what we left off talking about. We were talking about an invasive species. We already talked about this first bullet point. You need to know what an invasive species is. It's a non-native species. That's the first part. But before I move forward, I want to point out that just because it's not native does not make it invasive. For example, if you were to bring an alligator to Australia, not Australia, an alligator to Alaska, and leave it in some cold river, it's not going to make it, right? So yes, that was a non-native species, but it's not invasive. It's probably going to die within hours. So not only does it have to be non-native, but it has to spread far beyond its original point of introduction. And as you see in the second bullet point, it causes environmental or economic damage. Right, so those are the two things, right? It's not from this place, it's spreading, and it's causing damage. Now, when we talk about that damage, as we're going to talk about as we move forward, but you can see it here on the screen too, it colonizes and dominates suitable habitats. So that's how it goes. So any questions about what an invasive species is? Actually, I'm sorry. If you have a question, write it down because we got it, and then send it to me. I'll answer it later. We've got to get moving. I'm not going to ask you any questions about these numbers. This is just some examples from the old textbook. So for extra credit, you can look up any of this information and tell me what the current numbers are because, again, this is old. In the U.S., there are hundreds of invasive species, including plants, mammals, birds, fishes, arthropods, and mollusks. Really quickly, I would like to pause on this too. The whole plants thing, I'm going to bring this up again later today. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the woodpecker thing. These are such good examples because this is not necessarily common sense. This is why people need to know biology. This is important. I think common sense would tell you if you see a plant, like, hey, plants are good for the environment. Yay, if you were to just see a plant, your first thought is probably not like, let's kill that plant. Hopefully that's not your first thought. But if it's invasive, it is bad, right? So it would be good if you found an invasive plant to kill it, right? And again, that's usually counterintuitive. You think, oh, let's help the environment. Well, it's not kill plants, but sometimes that is the case. Or for some people even expand that to everything. They think of like feral cats in Australia or here, for example. Feral cats are actually one of the worst invasive species in the world. And most people don't think about trying to eradicate them or at least prevent them from breeding, but it needs to be done. Anyway, the estimated cost in the U.S. is about $137 billion a year, at least back when this book was written. Again, like I mentioned earlier, not every species that has been introduced becomes successful. Not all because they don't survive. And then some of those that do survive, sometimes they don't become invasive either because they're not necessarily causing damage, right? They're not necessarily out-competing the native species. So there is no single explanation why a non-native species turns into a damaging pest, but invasive species typically exhibit opportunistic life history pattern. That is another thing that you'll need to know about invasive species for the exam. So again, they're not native. They spread far beyond their original point. They damage the local ecosystems. They outcompete the native wildlife, and they usually exhibit opportunistic life history pattern. And really quick before I move forward, let me back up. And I use this example. I wish I had more time to talk about it because it really is fascinating to me. There's these Asian carps in the rivers in the United States, and they're so invasive. Like when you try to drive your boat through, I don't know if you can see it, but there's just hundreds, if not thousands of them jumping out of the water. You can see people very often get hurt because they'll jump out and hit the boaters as they're driving around. These boaters are having a little bit of fun with it. They're water skiing, and he's got protective equipment and a net. So he's catching them, and then he puts them in that little basketball hoop that has a bucket under them. But anyway, I forget which one, but if you click one of those videos, if you download the PowerPoint, and click that video, click that picture, there's a little video that talks about those Asian carps. It is interesting. Not important for the exam, but it is interesting. Here's another example. Another example. This is from the old textbooks. I'm not going to ask any questions about this example. But again, like I just said a few minutes ago, I love this example because I think, again, when people think of plants, they probably think this is good for the environment. So this is not necessarily common sense stuff. This is sometimes counterintuitive. So let's talk about it. Cheatgrass is a particular type of grass. It's a species that's invasive in the arid western United States. It covers millions of acres that formerly were dominated by native grasses and sagebrush. So again, I'm a biologist, right? But even me, if I were to go out to these states and like look upon a field of cheatgrass, and then maybe I'm in a car, right? And maybe 5 miles before that, I saw a field of grassage and sagebrush, like native vegetation. I wouldn't be able to tell a difference, right? So just common sense would just tell me if I'm looking at it, like even that field of cheatgrass to me would look healthy. Like, oh, look at all those plants. That must be healthy. But again, some of this stuff is not common sense. Anyway, this cheatgrass produces seeds earlier than the native vegetation, and it produces more than the native vegetation. So it's out competing it as far as reproduction is concerned, right? Because again, it's putting its seeds out earlier and then putting more out. So that's one way it's out competing the native. Also, it matures in the early summer. Because when it does that, it becomes extremely dry, right? When dry means it's very flammable. Because of that, these new fields of cheatgrass catch fire easier, right? So the fires are more intense and more often. But the cheatgrass is evolved for that, right? So that's okay for the cheatgrass, but for that native vegetation, it's not evolved for that. So again, this is how it's out competing the native vegetation. After a few fire cycles, basically the entire native population is basically gone for the most part. In this situation, there was over 150 species of birds and mammals that were affected too. And this is another point that I want to, hit on. A lot of people don't think about this. So you might just think, oh, you tree hugger, what do you care, right? So what? You have a field of this kind of grass, and now you have a field of this kind of grass. What's it matter? And that's where it matters, right? It's just not just the fact that you have this one new plant species that took out all the other native plant species, but it's an ecosystem. So all these things are relying on each other. So all these other little smaller animals who rely on the native plants for food and shelter and things like that, right? They're affected too, right? So now they are out of food and or shelter. So this is why it's a big deal. And then to make things worse, climate change has made things worse. Because cheatgrass responds better to increased CO2 levels. So I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about limiting factors, right? I said for the most part, plants, yeah, they need carbon dioxide, but for the most part, there's other limiting factors. So generally, if you give plants more carbon dioxide than they're currently getting in this atmosphere, it's probably not going to make much of a difference. But in this case, the cheatgrass does respond. It responds better. So for that reason, as the CO2 levels increase, this cheatgrass is going faster than the native grasses. Therefore, it's accumulating more tissue, and therefore that's more stuff for the fires, right, to burn. So the fires will become more and more intense as time goes on. So that's just one example. If you have any questions, write it down and ask me later. There's a picture of cheatgrass. Here's an animal example. I like this one. So again, like I said, I'm from Florida and Georgia, but I lived for a while right there south of the Everglades. So this one kind of hits close to home. The Burmese pythons are a great example of an invasive species in Florida. What happened is, you've got these people who buy these things as pets and they decide they don't want them anymore. So they think the humane thing to do is let them free. And for that individual snake, that is a very humane thing, right? Because it's going to thrive in these swamps and in the Everglades because none of the other animals are there are like evolved to escape the predation of these snakes. Right. So because of that, they're eating birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. They're starting to make things go extinct in that area because they're just so good at hunting. Because again, none of the native animals are evolved to avoid it. Not to mention, whatever diseases the Burmese python may have had in its normal range, diseases, parasites, predators, all those things, those don't exist in the Everglades. Right. So not only is it eating things that aren't evolved to defend themselves against it, but it doesn't have to defend itself against other stuff because it's, for the most part, because it's not in its native habitat. Anyway, again, if you have questions, write it down, ask me later. That's it for invasive species, at least for this chapter. We're going to bring them back in another chapter to talk about it from a slightly different perspective. For extra credit, if you want to look up, I don't know, look up some examples of native species from where you are. So if you're from West Virginia, right, what are some common invasive species here? Anyway, let's talk about biological control of pests. Oops, this is a little bit out of control. Well, no, it's not. It's kind of eases into it. It's a good segue. So like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about that Burmese python, one of the reasons it's so successful is because it doesn't have the normal pathogens and predators. And if it was a plant, an herbivore, so it doesn't have the things that are bad for it, right? It has all these things that are bad for it in its native habitat, the things that have evolved to kill it or parasitize it. Then you put it somewhere else and they don't have these. And this is, again, one of the reasons invasive species thrive. And this is where biological control comes in. You need to know what biological control is. I'll probably give you an example of it, and you'll have to recognize that as an example of biological control. It is the release of a natural enemy to attack a pest population. Now, it's not always in response to an invasive species, but that is very often how it's used. Which would make sense, right? Because again, if you have this species from elsewhere that doesn't have any natural enemies, so to speak, then you bring in the enemy from where it's from. But again, it's not just invasive species, it's also used to control insects. Again, sometimes native insects, sometimes native weeds, other organisms that reduce crop yield. So biological control is one of these things that's used a lot in farming. Here's an example of how it worked. It's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. Nonetheless, let's say the next word for attendance is weed, since it's up there. Anyway, again, the big X is just to visually indicate. I'm not going to ask any questions about this example on the exam. But there's a stuff called St. John's wort. It's a long-lived European weed that was invaded the Western United States again, right? So here we go with the Western United States. It has overgrown millions of acres of rangeland and pasture. And again, common sense might just tell you, you look out there like, hey, look at all those pretty plants. Things must be going well. This must be healthy for the ecosystem. But it's not, because this is not edible, right? And we're talking about the Western U.S. where these people are raising livestock. So when this invades, basically it's taking away their food. So to take care of it, research has reported leaf beetles, which are a native herbivore, right? Native to where the St. John's wort is from, and it worked. It reduced the weed to less than 5% of what it used to be, right? So it almost eradicated it completely. Again, this is old news. Maybe it's been completely eradicated by now. I'm not sure. But anyway, it restored the land's value, right? So now the native plants are growing and the livestock can feed. So that's an example of one time it worked. Here's an example of a time it didn't work. Indian mongooses. These things are fierce carnivores. They eat rats. Rats are one of those big invasive species. Humans are responsible for so many invasive species. Rats and cats mostly. But anyway, so we have these rat problems in the cane fields, so places like the Caribbean and Hawaii. We have these rats out there eating the cane, which is not good because they're trying to make money, right? But not only that, but then they also escape into the natural habitat. So not only, excuse me, let me back up. So they had the rats in the cane fields, which is why they put the mongooses in the cane fields, right? Because they probably didn't care anything about the environment, but they're like, hey, they've got to save their money because the rats are eating the canes. But the Indian mongooses did eat the rats. So, hey, that worked. But again, like it says right there, then they escaped. They escaped the cane fields and they started just going into natural habitats and killing other things. So they also then became invasive. And again, cats are a great example of this too, because people think, oh man, these rats are bad, and they are, and they're invasive, and they are. So people are like, let's just let the cats free. They'll take care of it. And they do, but then they become themselves extremely invasive. Anyway, if you have any questions, write that down, ask me later. Here's a picture of of a mongoose about to eat some egg of some native bird. Excuse me. Again, these PowerPoints are based off of the old textbook. Every chapter from the old textbook has this thing called the process of science. I leave it in there. That way, if you download it, you can read it. It's always good to read about science experiments to help you think scientifically, which is what this course is all about. But I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. Are any of you from the South? I don't remember. I think you're all from either out of state or excuse me, out of country or up north. Maryland? Kentucky. That's sort of South. Yeah, you guys are starting to get some cuts in some places, right? Yeah. in the Atlanta area, it's bad. It was bad when I was a kid, but now, like, as an old man, it's even worse now. Anyway, read about it if you want. There'll be no questions about kudzu or that process of science. But again, it's great to think scientifically. And this textbook was written for 100 level non-biology majors. So, it should make sense to you. All right, let's talk about integrated pest management. And actually, let me back up a second too, because I should have done this when we started. We've already finished talking about, we started talking about invasive species and we finished that. Let me talk about biological control of pests. What I should have done at the beginning of this conversation was take a step back to remind you what we're talking about overall is these applications of population ecology, right? This whole chapter is about population ecology. First, we talked about what it is and how it works. But then right now, we're talking about how we apply this. The last thing we'll talk about in that conversation is integrated pest management. Before I move forward, just so you know, in the exam, the question is going to be me describing a situation and then you recognizing it as integrated pest management. But as I mentioned before, so this first bullet point is not new. Agricultural operations create their own highly managed ecosystems, right? So you might not think of it as ecosystems. When you think of ecosystems, you might think of nature, but technically these farms are ecosystems, which is highly managed, right? But they're different than most ecosystems because they have genetically similar individuals, right? So if you just have a field of corn, for example, and it's all the same type of corn, they're going to be very genetically similar. Not only that, but you want to grow as much as you can, right? So they're going to be planted in close proximity, right? So because of those two things, these farms, right, they function as a banquet for plant-eating animals, including insects and things like that, pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungi, right? It's not good. And like I said, it's a monoculture. So if something comes, if there's some disease that's going to kill one of your corn plants, or just use that as an example, in theory, it could kill all of them. And since they're so close to each other, since they're so genetically close, genetically similar, then yeah, it's a bad situation. So like invasive species, most crop pests have opportunistic life histories. That also might be a question. So make sure you know that. Most crop pests have an opportunistic life history. Certain invasive species, we've already covered that. And that enables them to rapidly take advantage of favorable conditions. Right? So the history of agriculture has a lot of examples. You can look some of them up for extra credit if you want. But I'm going to use the example of boll weevil. And again, I feel like sometimes this old textbook was written for me because I also lived in Georgia for a while. And I remember as a kid learning about these things. These boll weevils are an insect that feed on cotton plants. One of the things that makes them interesting or more destructive is, I don't know, you might not know this much about insects or particular types of bugs, but the larva phase and the adult phase are very, very different. So not only are they different in the way they look and act, but sometimes in the way they eat. In this case, both the larval and the adults, they eat cotton. So throughout their whole life cycle. So it makes it even more devastating. Anyway, its unstoppable spread severely damaged local economies and had a lasting impact on the region. I'm not going to ask you questions about the boll weevil, but again, that's just one example. Right? There's a lot of examples of where we've had insects that have had devastating effects. And I like, again, it's not all about the economy, it's not all about the environment. Like you might be an environmentalist like I sort of am, but if you're just about money, well, this is about money too. There's a picture of a boll weevil. So let's talk about it. Again, we have these insects, we have these crop pests that we want to get rid of. How do we do it? Well, probably the first thing you think of is pesticides, and that works, right? We still use pesticides, but pesticides, while we still do use them, they also have the drawbacks, right? They could result in populations that are no longer affected by it. We've already learned about that, right? When we talk about natural selection, that was one of the examples I gave of natural selection in action. People are putting pesticides out. It kills the entire population almost, but there's a few weak individuals, strong individuals that make it. And then those are the ones that reproduce and start the new population, and they're basically immune to it, right? Because that's the new population. The other problem is pesticides can kill the pest. That part's good, right? You're killing the thing you're after, but you're also killing the things that kill the pests. And really quickly, I don't want to get on this soapbox too long, but this is one of the problems with organic farming. Because organic farming, they're allowed to use pesticides. It's just there's strict rules about which pesticides they have to use, and they have to be natural. And one of the differences between natural and I don't say fake, but manufactured synthetic pesticides. Natural pesticides generally kill everything, right? Because they're not very well, they're not synthesized, right? So it just basically kills all the insects, including the predators. Now, synthetic pesticides do better, right? The scientists who made these things, all right, this particular pesticide is only going to kill this group of insects. So in this way, this is just one of the ways, and that way, organic is actually more harmful than conventional farming. Anyway, I'll talk about that later. So that's one of the problems. Again, it's killing not just the pest that you're after, but also the things that kill the pest, which is bad. Also, maybe even more importantly, you're killing the pollinators, right? So you need, like, yeah, you're trying to kill the boll weevil, for example, but you still need bees, you still need butterflies, you still need these things that are pollinating, and you're killing them. So again, pesticides are useful, but obviously they have the drawbacks. This is where integrated pest management comes in, and you can finally learn what it is. It uses a combination of biological control, which we just talked about, chemical, which we talked about, right? That would be pesticides, and cultural methods. And that part might not make sense to you, but I'm going to explain it in the upcoming slides. So again, chemical or biological control, like we've already talked about, chemical, which would be pesticides, and cultural, which is what we're going to talk about on this next slide. So again, if you have questions, write them down, ask me later. So integrated pest management advocates for tolerating low levels of pests, not total eradication. That's a cultural thing, right? So that's not necessarily biological or chemical. This is more like changing the way you do things. That's what I mean by cultural. It's just changing the way you run your farm, so to speak. So that's one thing that we do. The other thing is lowering the carrying capacity. So instead of just growing one gigantic field of nothing but corn every year, first of all, you could throw in some pest-resistant varieties of crops, which again, I shouldn't say again, but I don't want to get on the soapbox either, but very often GMOs are better for the environment and people for this reason, right? So there's certain varieties of plants that are less susceptible to insects, therefore they can require less pesticides, or in some cases, no pesticides at all. Anyway, another thing they can do, again, this is cultural, mixed species planting. So again, instead of just having a giant one field of nothing but corn, maybe have some corn here, some cotton here, some peanuts here, whatever it may be. And then finally also crop rotation, which is sort of like the same thing, but instead of having all the different crops in the same field, you just grow different crops different years, right? So maybe one year you grow corn, and then the next year all those corn pests come back ready for their food. But then this year you're growing tomatoes, and it's completely different pests. So the herbivores that eat the corn, that population dies, and now a new population of tomato ears slowly comes in and invades. Anyway, again, those are just cultural changes. So biological control is also used when possible, like we mentioned. So here's an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this example, but aphids. This is tiny little things you can see here, right? Hundreds of them. And ladybugs, they eat them. So that's just another example of biological control. So if you have any questions, again, write them down, ask me later. I'm moving forward. Finally, so again, this whole chapter is about population ecology. So to remind you, population ecology is just when you study a particular population. So to remind you, a population is a specific species and individuals of that species that live in the same place at the same time, and they're affected by the same resources, or they're competing for the same resources, affected by the same climate, things like that. So now, knowing that, let's focus on the human population, right? So here we go. And if you ever take my 108 class, this information will be good. This will help you prepare you for that class. Anyway, in a few seconds it takes me to read this sentence, approximately 21 people on Earth will be born and 9 will die. So that's the rates. That's how quickly things are happening. Of course, this was back when this old textbook was published, which is before we had hit the 8 billion population mark. So these numbers might be slightly different now. You can look it up for extra credit if you want. Anyway, so as we've already mentioned before, but now we're looking at it from the view of humans, the cause of population growth or decline, right? The cause of the change in population size is an imbalance between births and deaths. So as you can see here, we have an imbalance between births and deaths, right? We have 21 born, 9 die. Hence, the population is still growing because we're adding more than we are subtracting. If you think about that as money, and we're talking about a bank account, what that's saying is like, all right, every 10 minutes, you're making 21 bucks, but you also have an automated bill pay and $9 are going right. I mean, I don't know who would have a budget like that where you're spending that kind of money and making that kind of money every 10 minutes. But, you know, you can imagine that in your mind. That means that person would be slowly making money because, again, they're making more money than they're putting out. Anyway, the human population is expected to continue increasing, at least for the next several decades. It is declining. The growth rate is declining. We'll talk about that in future slides. I'll talk about what that means. But it is still expected to increase. And I will say this, I'm going to explain it again in a different way on other slides. If I'm still using this money example, what we're saying here is this gap is starting to close. Right. So as this goes on, maybe you'll be making less money, right? So maybe you're making $20 and spending $9. Then you're making $18 and spending $9. Then you're making $15 and spending $9, right? So you keep making less and less, but you're still spending $9. The point is, as that number gets smaller, you're still making money, right? You're still making more money than you're spending. It's just that number happens to be going down. Does that make sense? You used to be making a lot of money every 10 minutes, but now you're making a little bit less. You're still making money. You're still profiting, so to speak, but the amount of profit you get is starting to become lower and lower. And that's what's happening with the human population. And this graph might look complicated, but but it's really not if you think about it. So this red line is straight up just the number of humans on Earth, right? And then right here, this is where it's projected to be after that year. That's what the red line is. The bars is the average annual increase. So again, if I'm going to use this, I'm going to use money as an example. You can think of this as the bank account, right? So the red line is how much money you have in the bank account, right? Just straight up how much money you have. And it's expected to increase and increase. And so you can see here, and this is what I want to make sure you understand. This is where it gets interesting. Starting wherever that was, maybe 1980s, 90s. Anyway, that's where it peaked, right? This is where you were making the most money, right? You were making a lot of money. This year you made a little bit less money. This year you made a little bit less money. You're going to keep making less and less money, but you can still see that the red line is going up. And I want to make sure you understand how that works. Right? So again, think of it as a bank account. You're still putting money into your bank account. This year they put more money in their bank account than they ever have. This next year they put money in that was less than that last year. The next year they put more money in, but it was still less than last year. They're still putting money in, and that's why the population is so big, right? We're still adding humans to the population. It's just that we happen every year we're adding fewer and fewer. So when people are worried about population decline, I don't think they need to be. That's my opinion. I don't usually like to share opinions, but I don't think we need to be, because even though we're adding fewer and fewer every year, we are still adding, right? So maybe at one point it will level out. At what's that there? Oh, that's increased total population. Yeah, 8 billion, right? We're probably right about here right now, and they're projecting it to level off. And again, I hate to share opinion, but in my opinion, it's not necessarily a bad thing. 85 or 8.5 billion people on Earth, that's a lot. And if it's leveled off, that means, it's not going down. It's just not going up. Anyway, any questions? If you have questions about that, write it down. There's going to be no questions about this on the exam. If anything, I might give you some picture like this, some graph like this, and ask you to decipher some particular thing about it, but that's probably not good. So let's talk about the history of human population growth, which we kind of did. But right there, we were more focused on this relationship between adding to the population and the overall population size. But let's talk about the history. Throughout most of human history, parents have had a lot of children. Like they don't, for the most part, they don't now. Like, I don't know if anybody wants to answer this, but how many kids does your parents have? Does anybody want to say? 2 for you, 2 for you, 2 for you. I have 2 biological kids and 2 adopted kids. So it's 2 for us too, biologically. So yeah, right. That's not a lot of kids. But back in the day, like for most of human history, this 2 kids thing is very relatively recent. It used to be just a bunch of kids. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is they didn't make it, right? A lot of them did not make it. So they're really hedging their bets by like, let's have a lot of kids because they're not all going to make it. A little side note too, a tangent here, it has nothing directly to do with this, but this is also one of the reasons when they say, oh, in the medieval days, the life expectancy was 35 years old. And it's not that a lot of people were dying at 35. It's just that life expectancy is just the average age. So when you have a bunch of kids dying, that's good, that's really going to make the average go down. So again, it's not that a lot of 35-year-olds were dying back in the day. It's just that because so many young people died, that skewed the average. Anyway, so even though, and this is not definitely, but almost definitely going to be a test question. You definitely need to know for most of human history, so not recently, but most of human history, the population growth rate was basically zero. Maybe a little bit up, maybe a little down, but for the most part it was zero because despite having a lot of kids were dying. But things changed. That's a lot of information. Basically what happened was things got better, right? So we had better nutrition, right? First of all, we figured a lot of things out, right? With nutrition, sanitation, medical science, all these things started getting better. And because of that, more people started surviving, including those babies, right? So now the death rate wasn't bad. The death rate started to decrease, but at first, it was still a cultural thing. People were still having a lot of kids. So because of that, that's when the population really started skyrocketing, because it was a cultural thing. Again, medically, biologically, we decreased the death rate, but because culturally people were still wanted to have a lot of kids, it caused the population to explode at first. Now it's around the 1900s. Now, like I said, I will ask you some of these questions, but you don't need to know these exact dates or anything. So anyway, by the mid-century, last century, the improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and healthcare spread to developing world. So it wasn't just the rich places. It started to develop to the poor countries. And this spurred a growth rate at a fast pace as birth rates far outstripped death rates. So again, long story short, last century, things started getting a lot better as far as medical stuff, things like that. And because of that, because of the still high birth rate, the population exploded. And now, and we don't really get into too much in this course, but now, depending on where you are on Earth, some people are still doing this, right? So there are still situations where some of these poorer countries, they're still having a lot of kids, even though the healthcare and things like that have gotten better. So some countries, generally poorer countries, have a much higher population growth rate than richer countries. Anyway, the world population skyrocketed from 2 billion in 1927 to 3 billion 33 years later. So that's pretty big, right? Put it next to this because I'm not going to ask you those numbers, but circle that 3 because 3 is the next word for attendance. So because of this, scientists became alarmed, and this is good, and I love this. And to this day, people still fight against this idea of like, oh man, we don't need to worry about population growth. We do. Now, I'm not saying that means you need to support everything that works on population growth rate, right? So for example, China, for a while there was telling people how many kids they can have. And again, I hate to share opinions, but my opinion is that's a bad thing. Great for the environment, but people should be allowed to have as many kids as they want, in my opinion. But nonetheless, it is still something to consider, and we still need to worry about it. Whether you agree with those things or not, we still need to worry about the science of it. Anyway, the overall growth rate peaked in 1962. Also not a question for this course, for this 100 level non-biology course, but yes, it did peak in the last century. At that point, the developed nations had advanced medical care that continued to improve the survivorship. So yes, the death rate was going down, as we mentioned earlier, but things started changing because now we had effective contraception, right? So the birth control pill, for example, was new back then. We've had a lot of changes. Think about birth control pills, vasectomies, different prophylactics, right? Better awareness, better sex education. So because of that, at least in the developed nations, right, the birth rate started going down. But the overall growth rate of the world's population began a downward trend as the difference between birth rates and death rates decreased. Again, we talked about that bullet point when we looked at that graph, right? So yes, we're still adding to the population every year, but we're adding fewer and fewer to the population every year. And again, for some people, they're alarmed about that. Oh, our growth rate dropped. But yes, our growth rate dropped, but it's still a growth rate. It's still growing. Right? We haven't even got to the point yet where it's leveled off, much less where we're losing population. Anyway, here's a table you can look at from the old textbook. I'm not going to ask you any questions specifically about this, but one thing you definitely should know, and this might be a question, I might not. But generally speaking, the growth rate, the population growth rate, is lower in richer countries and higher in more poorer countries. And you can compare again, like for the richer countries, the growth rate is lower than the world average. For the poorer countries, it's higher than the world average. So that's the trend you should know. Just like the ecological footprint thing. Like you don't need to know those exact numbers, but what you definitely need to know is, generally speaking, richer nations, or you in a richer nation, have a bigger footprint, generally speaking, than people in poorer nations. Anyway, let's talk about age structures. And we have talked about age structures already. But again, we're now looking at this whole chapter from the lens, like this context of just humans, right? We're looking at the human population. So age structures help predict the population's future growth. So last time we talked about age structures, I gave you that example of the bird, right? There's a graph that shows like the different ages of some population of birds. And my point was, if you were scientists who just got there and you just started studying those birds, you could capture as many as you can and tally how many of them are 5 years old, how many of them are 4 years old, right? And then from that, and I hope you guys can remember that graph in your head. From that, you could tell some things like, all right, 5 years ago, something really bad must have happened because there are no 5-year-old birds. But there's a lot of 7-year-old birds. So what happened? Let me check the records and see what happened 7 years ago, because there's a lot of things like that. But here it's different, right? Here, and you probably technically could do this with the birds too, but we're talking about human growth. You can use just straight the structure, like it says right there, to predict the projected age. Here's some examples. And that would be useful outside of biology, right? Think about probably whatever major you guys are, whether it's business, political science, criminal justice, all these things where it would help to know what the population is going to be, right? So this is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions. I need to speed it up and try to go through this quicker. I think this is the United States. It doesn't matter where, but this is, U.S. Census Bureau. So you can see back in 1983, this was the age structure of the United States. There was a lot of young people, like from 15 and under. There was much fewer, 30 to 34, much fewer, 30 to 45, whatever, you can read it. You can see it just gets a lot smaller, right? So a lot of young people, much fewer young people. And then in 2012, it's changed, right? So that group, everything's just kind of shifted up. But now instead of having this pyramid shape, we're kind of getting more of a cone shape where it does that pyramid's not until the top. And then in 2035, knowing what we started with and what we ended with, we can then predict that this is going to be what it looks like. And that's, again, helpful outside of biology. If you're a political scientist, you know now, like here, you're going to need a lot of schools, right? That's a lot of kids. Going to need a lot of colleges. Again, I'm thinking of it as a political scientist. Here, you're like, okay, well, we better start working towards nursing homes and hospice care, things like that. That's the kind of infrastructure that I, as a, elected official, need to be worried about. Anyway, those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions, but about this specifically. But anyway, this idea of going from here to here, there's a word for it. You might need to know for the exam, and it's called population momentum. This is the continued growth that occurs after a high fertility rate is reduced to replacement rate. In other words, if you take a step back and we'll talk about what we've already talked about. The human growth rate, the population growth rate, is getting lower and lower every year, as you hopefully remember from seeing those bars going down, even though the red line is going up. So even though the growth rate is getting lower, and even though one day, theoretically, we will hit replacement rate, meaning the growth rate will be zero, meaning however many people are born in a year, that's how many people are going to die in a year. But the point is, even when we hit that replacement rate, again, if we're at 8.5 billion when that happens, if we're lucky to be that low, if we're at replacement rate, that means the population is going to stay that large. That's a huge population. Even though it's not growing anymore, it's just a huge population. Anyway, this population momentum results from girls from the ages of 0 to 14 leaving that demographic and reaching childbirthing years. And that's what caused it, right? Anyway, if you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this 2-minute video on population momentum. If you have any questions, write them down. I'm moving forward. So this is basically stuff I've already said, so I'm going to read it just very quickly. It's in writing, right? Age structure diagrams indicate social conditions. Again, so this is important outside of biology, political science, business, criminal justice, right? Expanding populations have increasing needs for schools. If we're talking about young people, employment, again, depending on which age demographic is about to be the largest, right? All the infrastructure, right? Do we need schools or do we need nursing homes? Things like that. The next slide reveals important patterns in age structure from the U.S. from 1989 to 2035. So here it is again. Yeah, same thing. But anyway, again, you can see here, I wish we had more time to talk about it. I don't know if you guys ever heard of baby boomers, but there they were, right? There was this one point of recent human history where there's a lot of kids, right? Even past this little part where we started having fewer kids and the death rate also went down. Anyway, really quickly, I'll move forward and show you this. There will be no questions about it, but again, like I mentioned earlier, if you have this triangle shape, that just shows you that there's rapid growth, right? The population is growing quickly. When you have that, speaking of which, look, that J-shaped curve, right? You should think exponential growth. And you know that from the exam. But here, now we still have it's still steep, but you no longer have that curve, right? So it's still growing, just not as quickly. That's slow growth. Here, things, when you get that rounded shape, it's becoming stable. And here, we just don't know much about stage 4. Anyway, again, if you have questions, write those down. But like we can finish this chapter today and then maybe at least start the other chapters on Friday. Again, don't forget, you're still responsible for the material, so make sure you watch the older lectures if you need to. So really quickly, let's talk about our ecological footprint. I can go through this very quickly because you've already done the experiment, right? The U.S. Census Bureau projects a global population of 8 billion within 10 years. So again, I purposely have not changed this PowerPoint because this PowerPoint is less than 10 years old. And they were right. We did hit 8 billion here, 8 billion between 10 years it hit. Anyway, they also project a population of 9.6 billion by 2050. That's a lot of people. So the question is then, with all those people, do we have enough resources to sustain everybody, right? To do that, the world food production has to increase, amongst other things, as you know from that experiment. We have to be able to accommodate people expected to live in coming decades. So not only are we supposed to have more people, but because of advances in medicine, these more people are probably even going to live longer. And not only that, but here we are talking about adding more people to the world. Meanwhile, right now on this earth, people are dying of starvation, right? So that's a really good question. Can we sustain that many people when technically we can't even sustain what we have now? So for some examples, I'm not going to ask you about these specific examples, but this is stuff I want you to know about. Agricultural lands are already under pressure. We've done a lot of overgrazing to feed humans. And what we've done is turn grassland into desert, which is not only bad for the environment, but if you're grazing and now you have a desert, you know how you can no longer feed your cattle, your livestock. So you're out of money and you're out of food. Water usage has increased by 6 times in 70 years. This is an old PowerPoint. This was written before data centers were popping up everywhere. So I'll bet that number is even higher now. You can look it up for extra credit if you want. I don't think anybody was predicting data centers when they wrote this. The changes in precipitation due to climate change, both natural and human influence climate change, causes food shortages in some regions. And because so much open space is needed to support expanding population, other species are expected to become extinct, right? That's just common sense. As humans require more space just to live, just to grow their food, just to throw away their food and their trash, right? You have to kill things to take up space, right? Which brings us to what an ecological footprint is. You guys should already know it. You already did the lab, but it is the estimated area of land and water that's required to provide the resources an individual or a nation or region, whatever it is, however you're studying it, consumes, right? That includes food, fuel, housing, the ability to absorb waste, carbon emissions, which is a major component, as you guys saw, right? You saw almost all of you had a huge red chunk. No, I did, because we created a lot of carbon emissions. So when we compare our demand for resources with Earth's capacity to renew the resources, which is called biocapacity, and again, you should be familiar with that from the lab, that gives a broader view of the sustainability of human activities, which is why you had to do that table, that second table where you did the math, right? Here's this ecological footprint, here's the biocapacity, what's the difference? And if the difference was a positive number, that means that group or that person is consuming fewer resources than is being produced in that area, right? And then if it's negative, like it was for every one of you and me, if it's negative, that means you are, or your area is using more resources than is being produced, right? So you know that from the lab. According to the World Wildlife Fund, the average ecological footprint for the world population was 1.5 back when this was made. I'm not going to ask you to know the number, but what you do need to know about the number, the fact that it's over 1. Actually, I don't want to say that. Yeah. Hey, look at me. I didn't even put units. I wish one of you would complain about me. Like, hey, you forgot your units. Because you guys lose points when you forget your units. But that would be Earth's, right? Not GHA. Anyway, overshooting the biocapacity is the same thing as depleting our resources. And the next slide I'm going to show you compares ecological footprints of several countries. And again, I'm not going to ask you, I don't want you to memorize any of these specific numbers, but you do need to understand the trend. The trend is, on average, we are using more resources than Earth can provide in a year. On average, right? All of us together as a human population. That's one thing you need to know. Another thing you need to know is, generally speaking, in richer countries, we're using far more resources than poorer countries. So just understand those trends. This is why, for example, some people lost points when they said, I think my ecological footprint is the same as the world average. And then they would go on to say they think it's the same as the US average, but that can't be. Because by definition, the US average is a lot higher than the world average. So make sure you understand that concept. Another concept, less than a minute. One more concept that I want to make sure you understand, like how you might wonder, how does this work? How is it possible then that we're using more resources than we produce? What we'd be out of resources? But again, you could think of it as money. So think about the world. We have this huge bank account of resources, a lot of resources. So yes, we are using more than we're producing every year. But for now, we're okay because we have a huge bank account. But eventually, it's not sustainable, right? Eventually, when you keep taking more money out than you're putting in, you're going to run out. Again, I've already talked about this. You can see the numbers there. I'm not going to ask you the numbers. The point is, generally speaking, richer countries have a larger ecological footprint than poorer countries because we use more resources. Here's a picture that illustrates it. There's a picture of a family eating. This is where they normally eat in Afghanistan at the top. At the bottom is a typical Western kitchen. There's some concepts that are in the textbook that are not included. I'm not going to talk about them, but if you download the PowerPoint, because this is the end of the chapter, download the PowerPoint and read this if you're studying. This just shows you, like, okay, the stuff that's in this textbook, you do not need to know this stuff. So there you go. We're done with that chapter. When we come back on Friday, we'll do the best we can. But I have a feeling we won't be able to finish it all. And that's it. I will be here and online until 10:50. So if you need me for anything, you know where to find me. Don't forget to send the attendance words, screenshots if you're online or watching the video, and at least one question about the material covered in the lecture. And of course, you can ask as many questions as you want, and they don't have to be about the material. But for grading, you need at least one about the material. And again, if you're watching the video, like or comment on the video. It's just more evidence that you actually watched the video and your buddy didn't send you their copy of the screenshots.